Hi, I'm Robert, and this 10-minute training is on data collection for IEP writing. In the next 10 minutes, we will define quantitative and qualitative data, reliability and validity, talk about how data is used in the IEP writing process, evaluate potential potholes when using data, and order the different types of quantitative and qualitative data you may use based on their validity and reliability. To start, quantitative data is any data that's measured with numbers. Typically, we use time, grades, percentages. When we're talking about quantitative data, we're talking about quantities. As you know, we use quantitative data when we update IEPs and when we write goals and objectives for students. To remember quantitative, think about the N in quan. If this reminds you of numbers, that can be a very easy mnemonic. Qualitative data is any data that's measured with descriptors or words. When we collect qualitative data, we're using observations of our students, interviews, and student work. Qualitative deals with qualities, which is why I want to go back to the idea of student work. Yes, grades are quantitative, and we can use grades to tell us a lot about how a student is performing. But if you look at the picture, we're talking about that more complex. How does a student do during a project? How do they do on a multi-step process? How do they revise? That's where you want to get in with qualitative with that rich description. And in order to keep it separate from quantitative, remember that qual has the L, and the L can remind us of language. Before you can talk about different types of data sources, you need to discuss validity and reliability. Here's a simple graphic and two simple definitions. Validity means that the item measures what it is supposed to measure. Reliability tells us that it's measuring it consistently. In order to be valid, an instrument has to be reliable. So let's look at this illustration. All the way on the right, you have a target where the arrows are all over the place. They're neither reliable nor are they valid because they're not hitting the target, the bullseye, and they're not hitting it consistently. If you go all the way over to the left, it's very reliable because all of the arrows are consistently hitting the same spot, but they're not hitting the bullseye, so it's failing to measure what we want to measure. So as we look at data collection, we want to focus on data that not only measures what we want to measure, it's consistently producing those results. When you look at the process of data and IEP writing, it's a relationship between exploring and surveying, and it makes me think of a literal explorer and surveyor. When we meet a student for the first time, we go into a lot of qualitative data collection. We learn about them, their preferences, their interests, what do we need to know about how they learn, and from that, we identify their academic and functional strengths and weaknesses. Once we've identified those strengths and weaknesses, we have to go in with quantitative data to apply boundaries to our education plan. We will gather data to produce a baseline and use those baselines to project their progress through the year. What's interesting is qualitative and quantitative have what I like to think of as a back and forth relationship. At the beginning, we may start with qualitative to get that big picture and that rich description of the kid, and then use quantitative to kind of give us a frame and a roadmap. But after we've gathered all of that progress data, we need to turn around again and talk about, well, how did they do? And put that rich description back in, which takes us back to qualitative. In a similar way, we go from PLAF to goals to progress to PLAF to goals. So you see how qualitative and quantitative constantly are going back and forth. Now bear in mind, with any data collection, there's potential potholes. With qualitative, the potholes to consider are personal bias, which for teachers, the three biggest biases are noise, student movement, and student-teacher interactions. Your preferences in these three categories will influence what you see in a classroom observation. It could look like noisy, highly engaged, controlled chaos, or it could look like bedlam, depending on your tolerance levels. Similarly, we need to remember that in an IEP meeting, differing perceptions are coming to the table. Your interactions with the student may paint one picture in your mind. The student may go home and have totally different stories about school. So mom comes in with her perceptions, and student comes in with their perceptions, and administrator comes in with totally different. We need to always remember with qualitative data, everyone may be looking at the same kid, but they're not seeing the same situation because they're bringing their own biases. Therefore, when writing a PLAF, paint a rich, complete narrative, but be concise and stick to the facts. Do not insert your opinion into an IEP document at any point. With quantitative data, it's great because it's reproducible, it's numbers, it's very consistent. However, to get to those good consistent numbers, you have to control the compounding variables. You have to control the student being distracted. It helps to think of kind of like state testing. Think of your STAR test. Think of all the layers of control that they put on that test to make sure it's valid. No cell phones, monitored bathroom breaks, timed. That's getting really good quantitative data. Of course, that means that you have to plan for how you're going to control those variables and make time for those assessments. And if you're looking at updating all of your case kids at the end of 9 weeks or right before the winter break, that's a lot of work. So the solution is to take small, frequent assessments of your students throughout the year. Look at the students in your inclusion class. If you don't see your case kid throughout the day, coordinate with other case managers so that you're getting these small, frequent assessments, and backwards plan. Look at your calendar. Look at the nights that you need to go pick up your son or daughter from daycare. Look at the times when you need to get a bus. Look at the day that you're going to be exhausted because you were at a game across town all night and have just come back. Don't make those the days that you're trying to gather data and plan. However, if you know when you're going to be especially busy and not as busy, it can be easier for you to map out when you have time to collect and analyze your data. The last piece we're going to talk about within this module is ranking IEP data sources. So if we use this 4-point grid, I'm going to put qualitative on one side and quantitative on the other. We can rank data as having high validity or low validity. Qualitative data with low validity is going to be vague. Qualitative data with high validity will be very focused, which is going back to that rich picture, sticking to the facts. Quantitative data with high validity will be multiple measures. We'll see what the kid is doing over a period of time, which makes it easier to project what we think they will do in the future. Quantitative data that's low validity will be a one-time event or have a very small group of kids included in the sample. So if we look at some examples, vague qualitative data may include our observations, which can be biased, our personal perceptions, also biased, and teacher reports. It doesn't mean that we should not use these data sources, but this should not be the only data we're using to write our IEP. Instead, we should try to pull in student work samples, especially if they're written work or projects, input from parents, and input from student transition interviews if you're working with a transition age student. You can also use an ABC chart, which is a behavior monitoring chart, and we'll talk about that more in a future module. Quantitative data that's a one-time event can help kind of frame our big picture, and that can include the student's current inclusion minutes, that can include curriculum-based assessments and benchmarks. These are good, valid instruments, but they're spread out over time, and they may not really capture where the kid is right now. Another very valid instrument that's a one-time event is your STAR test. So you can use those items to set the big picture, but then go in and support it with gradebook report, teacher-made tests, information from the student's formal evaluation, information from their transition assessment or task analysis. So at the end of this module, I want to give you a chance to reflect and apply. As you reflect, I want you to consider what data sources are you currently comfortable accessing and using to write IEPs? And then extend that, what sources would you like to incorporate? If this feels overwhelming, consider adding 2 to 3 different types of data collection to your toolbox every 9 weeks. By the end of the year, you'll have built up several strategies, and it'll give you time to be more comfortable with it. For application, for my people who like to have a goal, I challenge you for your next annual ARD meeting to have a goal of using 5 to 10 different data sources when you write your PLAF. Now let's look at that grid again. When I say 5 to 10, I do not mean 5 teacher reports or a star score and 4 benchmarks. I think that you need to use some of the data from the low validity to help paint the big picture, but I really want to challenge you to get in and use that high validity. That's really everything I have in this 10-minute training. I want to thank you for taking the time to visit with me, and I want to thank you for the time you spend with our kids. What you do makes a difference.